Welcome to the Lawyering Peace series, where we explore the intricacies of diplomacy and law in peace processes. Join us as we dive into discussions with individuals who have played key roles as diplomats or lawyers in negotiating peace. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Williams, the founder and the president of the Public International Law and Policy Group, and the Rebecca Grazier Professor of Law and International Relations at American University. In this interview, I am joined by PILPG Senior Peace Fellow Bob Perito. Bob and I have known each other and worked together on various peace-related projects around the globe for over 30 years. Thank you for joining us today, Bob. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Paul. It's nice to be back together with you again. And I look forward to talking to you about the Angola peace negotiations.
Me too. I'm really excited about our conversation today. Now, for our listeners, Bob has been involved in post-conflict processes in a number of regions and states around the globe, including in Angola, Haiti, Liberia, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq, and in Libya. Now, in today's conversations, we'll focus on Bob's career as a Foreign Service officer with the U.S. Department of State, during which time Bob led the U.S. delegation to the Angola peace talks that ended in the signing of the Bosisi's Accords, receiving a Presidential Meritorious Service Award for his leadership of that delegation. Angola's civil war lasted for nearly 3 decades following the end of Portugal's colonial rule in Angola and Angola's independence in 1975. The Portuguese withdrew without formally handing power to any of Angola's active liberation movements, and the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola, MPLA, declared itself the government of an independent Angola. A civil war immediately ensued, characterized by intense fighting between the MPLA, the National Front for the Liberation of Angola, and the National Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA. The Angolan War involved 3 peace agreements, the first of which was the Bosisi's Accords, also known as the Estoril Accords, was signed in May of 1991. After the 2-year post-conflict peace process ended in an election loss, UNITA reignited the conflict, which continued until 1994 with the signing of the Lusaka Protocol. Subsequently, fighting resumed to the death of the leader of UNITA in February of 2002. His death created an opportunity for a new chapter in Angolan politics and paved the way for the Angolan government and UNITA to sign a final memorandum of understanding, marking the formal end of hostilities and the collapse of UNITA. Now, with this context in mind, let's dive into our discussion. Bob, you were involved in negotiating the first peace agreement of the Angola Civil War, the Bosisi's Accords. Can you give us a sense of the United States' role in the negotiations and in the implementation of those accords? And why was the United States such a pivotal player in these talks?
Thank you, Paul. Okay, I think we have to step back a moment and look at the context in which these negotiations occurred. The Angola peace agreement came in the context of the US-USSR detente and in the wind down of the Cold War. The Angola conflict was one of a number of what were called regional conflicts. They were actually proxy wars between the United States and the Soviet Union, and that both countries wanted to bring to an end. The other conflicts in this group were Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and Cambodia. The US-USSR decision to stop providing military assistance to the Angola government and UNITA, which was the National Liberation Organization that was opposing the government, this decision to stop providing military equipment was critical to bringing an end to the conflict. Now, the accords also came in a regional context, not only an international context, but a regional context. And this was an effort by the United States to achieve peace in the Southern African region by doing the following: obtaining an end to apartheid and then bringing about a majority rule in South Africa, obtaining independence for Namibia from South Africa, and then bringing an end to Angola's civil war. The Angola negotiations were in some ways just a continuation of negotiations that had been going on previously for about 4 years. These negotiations ended on December 22nd, 1988, with the signing of the tripartite agreement between Angola, South Africa, and Cuba. This agreement resulted in the withdrawal, of 50,000 Cuban soldiers from Angola, and in South Africa's agreement to allow Namibia to proceed with a year-long transition to independence. The US led the Namibian talks. Subsequently, the US, USSR, Angola, South Africa, and Cuba, some strange countries to be working together, oversaw the UN administration of the Namibian transition to independence. That was going on at the same time that Nelson Mandela had been released from prison in South Africa. And then the US was involved in all of these things, and particularly in achieving political reconciliation in South Africa. Now, my role at that point, I was the director of the Office of Southern African Affairs in the Department of State. I played a role in all of these initiatives. My office had responsibility for 8 countries in Southern Africa, and so we were engaged in a variety of instances. And I'll tell you a little story which maybe will dramatize what this was like. The Namibian independence transition was supervised by this group of countries: Angola, USSR, US, South Africa, and Cuba. And these countries met periodically to discuss how this transition was going and to resolve difficulties, of which there were many. When the Angolans got their chance to host the talks, they hosted it in a bombed-out village on the Angola side of the Namibian border. We flew up to the village on small aircraft and helicopters. The talks were held in a tent city that the Angolans had created. Each delegation got its own tent, and then there was a larger tent there for the talks. The talks dragged on into the evening. As the sun went down, it became cold. And finally, 2 people, the head of the UN mission in Namibia, Mata Ahtisaari, the UN Secretary General Special Representative, and also the future president of Finland, and my immediate boss, Ambassador David, who was leading our delegation to these set of talks, they decided to build a fire. And so they went out into the woods in the darkness, collected firewood, brought back, and built a bonfire. All of us gathered around to keep warm. But after a while, the bonfire burned down. Suddenly there was noises behind us. We turned around, and out of the darkness emerged a group of soldiers in uniform with their rifles slung on their shoulders and their arms full of firewood. They dumped the firewood onto the fire and disappeared into the back, off into the darkness. I recognized who these people were. They were Cuban soldiers. And then it dawned on me. Here we were, 6 American diplomats in Angola, a country we had no diplomatic relations with no contact with the outside world. This was long before cell phones. Our perimeter security was being provided by the Cuban army. Who are they protecting us from? Who was out there in the dark? Well, of course, it was UNITA, the organization that we were providing arms to in the Angola Civil War. So anyway.
Peace talks make strange bedfellows.
That's
very cognitive dissonance, yes.
Okay, so let's talk about the Angola talks. So the talks lasted over a year. They involved 7 formal negotiating sessions. Portugal served as the moderator. The parties were the Angola government and UNITA, and the observer delegations came from the United States and the USSR. In addition to these talks, the direct negotiations, there were higher level meetings involving the USSR, US, and Portuguese foreign ministers, and at some point, the United Nations. Now, the US role in all of this, to answer your question, was pivotal. At a meeting in Houston, this is an example, between Secretary of State Baker and Soviet Foreign Minister Shevardnadze on December 12, 1990, they agreed to have a meeting the next day as follows. Secretary of State Baker would meet with the Angolan foreign minister in his office in the State Department. At the same time, Foreign Minister Shevardnadze would be at the Soviet embassy in Washington, and he would meet with Jonas Savimbi, the leader of UNITA. Now, neither of these parties had relationships with each other, But the point of view of that was to demonstrate to the Angola parties that the United States and the Soviet Union wanted this conflict to end, and that we were really serious about cutting off military assistance. Okay, then the next day, we had talks at the State Department at my level, at the delegation level. At that point, the United States presented a set of principles which had previously been approved by the Soviets. And these principles were as follows, so you could get an idea of what the issues were in the conflict. The first principle was that there would be a UN supervised ceasefire. The second was that Angola would become a multi-party state, not just a Marxist-Leninist totalitarian state. That there would be internationally monitored free and fair elections, that the date of the ceasefire would be linked to the date of the elections, that the US and the Soviet Union would cut off military assistance on the day the ceasefire was signed, and that everyone would work together to create a new national Angolan army, and that army would be in place before the elections in order to keep the peace. Two more points in this story. In January, right after that, the next month, 1991, the US, the USSR, and Portugal at my level met in Lisbon to bring together all of these points and turn them into 3 documents that would set the framework for the political settlement. One document on political principles, one on ceasefire, and one on concepts for the negotiations. A month later, the 6th round of the talks were held in Lisbon. The assumption was that the parties, the Angola parties, would then come and they would sign these documents, and then we would be, well along toward the settlement. The talks were frustrated, however, by the fact that the Angolan government delegation refused to sign and really refused to do anything. We then had a separate meeting of the 3 governments, and this is a little story about the perils of being a negotiator. And that is, we decided, or all agreed, that we would issue a joint statement from the 3 governments about the fact that the Angolan talks had been aborted and the role that had been played by the Angolan government. And so when these conversations started, we were in a room in the foreign ministry. We had outside the door a telephone line, which I could use. It was open to the State Department. So as we went through the statement line by line, I would periodically get on the phone and say, this is what it says. And I would wait, and then somebody in the State Department would say, okay, that's fine. Or no, don't do that. So at one point, the key phrase was, how did the 3 governments feel about the fact that the Angolan government had blocked the negotiations? And I offered the word deplore. So the sentence would read, the 3 governments deplore the action of and to my great surprise, it was agreed. So I got up, I went out, I got on the phone, and I said to my State Department colleague on the other side of the ocean, I got deplored. This is the way it reads. They deplore. And I could hear him saying, wow. And then I could hear people in the back of the room who were listening on, speakerphone saying, wow, Perito got deplore.
Okay.
As it turned out, I found out, long later that the 3 translators in the room had found words in Portuguese and in Russian that were a lot less dramatic than the word deplore. And so at the end of the day, all the 3 governments got a statement that I think served their domestic political interests.
So it's the translators who are the real negotiators, is what we're learning here.
The translators are very important, and we'll talk about the US translator in these talks later, I hope.
Well, Bob, you mentioned Marty Ahtisaari as the UN's special envoy, and we all know that he went on later to, have his own organization doing peace talks, played a critical role in Kosovo, played a critical role in the Aceh Indonesia negotiations. Tell us a little bit about Marty Ahtisaari's role, other than basically building bonfires and the UN role writ large.
Okay. Let's talk about the UN at this point. First of all, Marty Ahtisaari was in the talks that concerned the transition to independence in Namibia. So he was not a player in the Angola negotiations, but he was, of course, extraordinarily important in the Namibia's transition to independence. He also turned out to be a really great guy. Okay, let's talk about what the UN role was in Angola. So first of all, the fact that Angola, the Angolan government, Angola was a sovereign state with a seat in the United Nations General Assembly placed constraints upon the role that the international organization could play and on the behavior of its representatives. UN representatives were acutely aware that the Soviet Union, with its seat on the Security Council, and Angolans, African allies, and other socialist countries in the General Assembly could make life pretty miserable for the UN Secretariat if Angola's rights in these negotiations were impinged. So the UN was very, very cautious. So on March 19th, 1991, I went up to New York and I met at the UN headquarters with Undersecretary General Golding to talk about including a UN technical observer, a UN military officer, in the talks to provide information on ceasefire modalities. From that time on, then that meeting, and from that time on, United Nations representatives made it perfectly clear to us that there was no political support and no money available for a UN peacekeeping force. They also pointed out to us that Angola's size, it's a gigantic country, and its terrain, mountains and jungles and whatever, hard to get around in, plus the combat experience and the firepower of its armed forces on both sides of the conflict ruled out any UN peacekeeping force. They would not contemplate, and they were very worried about the possibility that there could be a United Nations peace force operating in Angola, a UN member state, and find itself in a confrontation with the Angola armed forces. So no peacekeeping forces. What they could do, however, is they could make available a UN military observer mission. Okay, the UN military observer mission would observe the ceasefire, but it would do little else. And so they made it clear that if there was going to be a policing of the ceasefire, then the Angolans would have to do that themselves. And they also made the point that unless the Angolans fully supported the agreement would be aborted anyway. And so we came back to the talks and we spun this situation in the following way. We told them that the international community recognized Angola's importance, Angola's maturity as a state and as a society, and the fact that unless the Angolan parties really supported this agreement, it wasn't going to work. And so what we would have would be to have this military observer force. So what the talks evolved with was a plan to preserve the peace. And the plan involved the parties moving their heavy weapons, their troops, and their equipment into cantonments where they could be demobilized. And then some of the equipment and some of the personnel would be taken out and form the new national army. The rest of the people would go back to civilian life. During this process, teams of Angolan and UN observers would be stationed around the country to monitor ceasefire compliance and to resolve any disputes. Okay, these three-member UN teams, these three-member teams would include the following makeup. There would be a government representative, there would be a military representative, and there would be a UN observer. When there was a claim that there had been a violation of the ceasefire, the assumption was that there would be a vote of the three. The Angolans would cancel each other out, and the UN military observer would make the decision as to whether there was a violation or not. Okay, this proved to be more of a challenge than we expected, since both sides violated the agreement, both sides withheld their most effective fighting units, hedging against the fact that there might be a negative outcome on their side for the talks. And neither party were interested in creating an effective new national army that they would have to deal with. So the army never happened, and both sides hedged and were ready to restart the war. The role of being a UN military observer in Angola proved to be extremely difficult. The force was small, 300 men or so. It suffered from hardships because there was a lack of quarters, offices, administrative, and logistic support. Also, these UN personnel they were unarmed, they operated alone, and they were vulnerable to attack. And so there were several situations where UN observers were either killed or injured. So that's pretty much it for the UN role,
Okay, so
which was essential but somewhat limited.
Yeah, almost a no-win situation because of Angola's status in the General Assembly, the USSR, on the Security Council, that it was such a trim mandate. And I know you and I worked quite a bit on Bosnia and in Kosovo in subsequent years, and there were any number of early on observer missions, which kind of were reflective of unarmed monitors in very precarious situations. Now that
One, one,
eventually jump
yeah,
on in.
one more small point on this, and that is that subsequent to this, historians and journalists have written extensively about why the agreement failed, and they've placed the blame on the United States for failing to assure that there was a large peacekeeping force there that could have kept the peace. But in fact, as we know, no UN peacekeeping force would have been large enough to carry that off, and no peacekeeping force in Angola would have had a mandate to do what's now called peace enforcement. So that was just never in the cards.
Yeah, the UN forces weren't structured that way for peace enforcement at that time.
That's right.
Well, Bob, let's shift gears a little bit to specifically your role in leading the U.S. delegation. And can you share with us, your overarching objectives, your responsibilities, and what does the day-to-day operation of a head of delegation in a peace process for the United States look like?
Okay. Okay, let's start there, and then eventually we can get on to who was in the U.S. delegation and how do we go about doing our business. Okay, as the leader of the U.S. delegation, I had a number of roles. First of all, I was the lead presenter. So when the delegation spoke, and I was the person who did the talking, and my colleagues on the delegation supported that in various ways. I was also, as it turned out, the chief strategist. And so throughout the time the talks were ongoing, I was doing little memos to my bosses in the State Department and to other people, laying out a strategy. And sometimes the strategies were about how we were going to deal with issues. Sometimes the strategies were about how we were going to move the talks forward logistically. Some were strategies about how to bring countries onto our side and how to get our message out. And so I was the planner. I was also something of a coordinator. As the head of the Southern African office, I had all of these things going on at the same time. And I had a staff of about a dozen people who were working in the office on each of these things. And so I coordinated the staff because we had people working on Namibia full-time, people working on South Africa full-time, people working on Angola full-time. And they had to be integrated. And eventually we picked up Mozambique and the Mozambique peace talks. So we had all of these countries engaged in what was a regional effort to settle agreements. There were overlaps. And so there was a coordinating role here. I was also an envoy. And so one of the things that the US did was to travel around Europe and Africa during the talks and engage with governments and try to get them to join our side of the issue, and also to support our side and also to stop supporting the other side. And so there were a lot of countries involved. Ivory Coast, for example, Zaire, other African states, and then the British played a really interesting role in these talks. And at one point, the United States had no relationship with Angola, no diplomatic relations, but we had to communicate with the Angola government. We did that through the British. The British had an embassy in Luanda. And of course, they had an embassy in Washington. So after the talks got rolling, there was an officer from the British embassy who would attend our meetings. And so he would come over and sit in our meetings. We had full disclosure. We would tell him, he would go back, send the message to London, they would send it to the embassy. So the embassy in London knew what was going on. When we visited Luanda, we were picked up at the airport by the British embassy and taken to our hotel. Luanda was in terrible shape at that time. The hotel was multi-stories. The joke was, hope the elevator runs all the way up, for the power dies. I remember getting in my room and there was a knock on the door, I opened the door, and there was a second secretary of the British embassy holding my bags. So anyway, okay. So there was that. I was also the briefer. And so every time we would hold a round of negotiations or something important would happen, we would convene the diplomatic corps in Washington at the State Department, and I would brief on what was happening in the negotiations. And that turned out. I would also do press interviews and, get out the word. And then there was my old job as being office director. And so there are things that office directors in the State Department do. And one time I was in Rome and we were trying to get the Mozambique talks organized. And it had been a really busy week and we had Sunday off. And I was planning to sleep in on Sunday morning and then go out with my colleagues in the delegation to see Rome. And this was going to be like a big deal. On Saturday, I get a telegram from the Department of State saying that I should take a flight on Sunday morning to Paris, be prepared to participate in a meeting Sunday afternoon with Secretary Baker and Jonas Savimbi, take notes on that discussion, go to the embassy afterwards, turn my notes into a reporting cable, send that cable back to Washington so it would be there on Monday morning, so that I'll go forward. And so I, grumbling, got on the flight. I flew to Paris. I got off the flight. And I remember sitting in a cab thinking how awful it was that I didn't get to spend my Sunday in Rome. And suddenly a small voice in the back of my head said, "Hey, it's a beautiful spring morning. You're in Paris."
You're in Paris.
What's matter with you? Okay, so
I was thinking the same thing, Bob. My little voice in my head right at this very moment was saying, well, okay, it's still Paris.
It's still Paris, right? And it was, anyway. So U.S. objectives. Okay, the U.S. objectives were, first of all, a ceasefire in Angola, followed by a peaceful transition to elections and democratic rule. So to achieve this, we needed to do several things. We needed to create institutions, and there were a number of those, commissions, that would supervise the peace process. We also needed to create permanent institutions that would keep the peace, like a unified national army in a multi-party state. So should we talk about the U.S. delegation, or
yeah, let's talk about the U.S. delegation, because clearly as the leader of the delegation, you played a very eclectic role with all of the different responsibilities. You also had a team with you. How did you structure the team? How did you divide up responsibilities? What was the secret sauce to having an effective delegation?
Okay, the delegation sort of was decided upon by the U.S. bureaucracy. So the delegation was made up of representatives from the offices and bureaus in the State Department and the Department of Defense that were interested in Angola and Africa in general in Angola. So these were the members of my delegation. And this is in no priority order. This is just sort of how it came out. Okay, first there was Walter Kansteiner. Walter Kansteiner was a political appointee, and he served on the policy planning staff at the State Department. He was the Africa guy on the policy planning staff. Walter was a terrific guy, but he's also proved invaluable because the way the State Department is structured, the policy planning staff has its offices right next to the Secretary of State's office. The director of the policy planning staff is an important person who sees the Secretary of State all the time. If we wanted to get information to the Secretary of State without going through the bureaucracy, we would simply tell Walter, tell your boss that we need X or Y, and Walter would do it. Okay. The second person I want to talk about is John Byerly. John Byerly was our lawyer from the Office of Legal Affairs at the State Department. John was invaluable. He had this wonderful quality of not only being able to tell us what we shouldn't do, but also be able to figure out ways that we could do what we needed to do if we just did it in the right way. John became the drafting officer for almost all the things that went down on paper, from policy positions to actually the final agreement itself. And then John was our liaison to the officers in the other delegations. And there were always lawyers around it, and they would go off, and talk to each other. And that was always very helpful. One of the key people in our delegation was Colonel Charles Snyder from the Department of Defense's Defense Intelligence Agency. Charlie had, first of all, a terrific sense of humor, but also he had an interesting background. In the early stages of the Angola Civil War, there were three National Liberation Army organizations fighting for control. One of them was the Front for the National Liberation of Angola, the FNLA. The FNLA was sort of our first choice, the United States, and it was based in Zaire. And so to help the FNLA, the United States Army quietly sent a team of advisors, Army advisors, to help them out. Okay, when the time came, the FNLA invaded Angola and began a march toward Luanda, the capital. The U.S. Army advising team followed them into Angola, but at a discrete distance. The FNLA was doing famously until it ran into 50,000 Cuban soldiers in the Cuban Expeditionary Force, and then they turned around and ran. And as Charlie and his colleagues were moving toward the front, all of a sudden, their Angola allies were running past them in the other direction. Charlie and his buddies then figured out what was going on, and they followed, and they just barely made it across the Zairian border before the Cubans and the Angolans got there. Now, as when the talks began, it was clear that the Angolan soldiers, the Angolan military officers, and the Cuban military officers who we were working with knew about this incident. And so they used to kid Charlie about it all the time. And they would say, last time you gotta be careful. We almost got you the last time, But the fact that Charlie had been on the battlefield in Angola, and the fact that, he'd had all these experiences, bonded him with the military members of these other delegations. And so he was sort of a brother in arms, and that helped enormously because they trusted him. There were two other people. One was a Colonel, Kim Hennington, who was from the Department of Defense, and he was from that part of the Department of Defense, the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy that deals with the State Department. There was a guy named Jeff Millington, who was a State Department officer assigned to the political section in the embassy in Lisbon. Jeff was involved in something which I thought was really interesting. The peace talks were a huge news item in Portugal. It was a huge political issue, and there was massive coverage. And every time we would come to town, there would be headlines in all the major newspapers. And my last name, Perito, is a word in Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese, and it means expert or specialist.
There you go.
At the beginning of one of these rounds of negotiations, there was an item in a Portuguese language newspaper that said, "We all know that Mr. Perito, Mr. Expert, is the leader of the U.S. delegation, but the fact is that Mr. Perito is not the real expert, is not the real Perito in the delegation." Then I went on to explain that the real Perito in the delegation was Jeff Millington, our local hometown boy who was from the embassy. So, and the final guy on the delegation was Alex Chavo, and Alex was the interpreter. Alex was a simultaneous translator, and he could translate in Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, Russian, all the languages. Alex was a terrific guy. Everybody loved Alex. And at points in the Namibian talks, Alex would go in and translate for the Cubans' talks for the Soviets. He would also do other things like that. I would also always then grab Alex and say, "What did they say? What did they say?" And Alex would explain that when he was doing simultaneous translation, his brain was just flipping one word for another. And he came out of those talks, he said, not remembering anything that had been spoken.
All right. Yeah, the inside scoop, the inside story.
The inside scoop went through and out.
Literally in one ear and out the other.
So to conclude, I mean, obviously this was a band of brothers. We traveled widely in that year and a half. We went all over Africa and Europe. We were involved in, these same guys showed up in the Mozambique talks. They were in the Namibia talks. They were also in South Africa doing things, sometimes as members of my delegation, sometimes as members of other groups, sometimes operating on their own. So this group of people really worked extremely well together.
So, Bob, let's talk a little bit about, shed some light on how this delegation, this group of this band of brothers dealt with some of the contentious issues in the Angolan conflict. So I guess it's a two-part question. First is, what were the primary issues of contention? You mentioned earlier the principles for democracy, a multi-party Angola, ceasefire. What were the main points of contention? What were they literally and figuratively fighting over? And then, what was the strategic approach of your delegation to help the parties get to yes and to help that be a durable yes?
Okay, well, the most unique thing about the Angola talks was that after that session, which was aborted in Lisbon, the three governments got together and decided that what was needed was to sequester the delegations.
Mm.
And so in April 1991, the three delegations arrived in Lisbon, and we were brought to a newly built but yet unoccupied technical college in Bicesse, which is a suburb of Lisbon. And we were literally locked in to the building and told not to come out without an agreement.
Wow.
Okay.
Were these like modern, nice accommodations, or there were student
Well,
accommodations within the
well, it
student?
was sort of student accommodations. So this being locked in created a kind of unique dynamic among the delegations because we all slept in dormitory rooms. We would all get up in the morning and meet in the cafeteria to have our breakfast, then lunch, then dinner. We would held our meetings in converted classrooms. And then in the evening, we would all get together in what was to become the teacher's lounge, and we would watch, Angolan television or Portuguese television. Okay, so that was really unique.
And what contentious points were?
All right, well let me
noted
go on.
there?
All right, so the way these talks worked. So we're there, we're sequestered. We organized ourselves into two working groups. Okay, so the first working group was the military working group, and all the military officers that were there and all the delegations, plus the UN military observer who arrived and allowed himself to be locked up with us, met every day. And they would deal with the following issues, which were when was the ceasefire going to take place and how was it going to be arranged and enforced? The cantonment of troops and weapons, the role of the UN military observer mission when they planned. What about DDR, the demobilization of those fighters who wouldn't join the national army? And then there was the whole issue of how would we go about creating a new national army? In the end, the British offered to come in and train it, but there were a lot of issues as to how this was all going to happen. This group created and designed a joint commission on the formation of the Angolan armed forces. That joint commission then had responsibility after the talks for doing a number of things. The commission would be organized, composed of the US, USSR, and Portugal as observers, the two Angolan parties, and then the UN would participate. The goal of this joint commission was to demobilize 152,000 active fighters on both sides, and then integrate those that weren't demobilized into the new Angola National Army and form a 50,000-man Angola Armed Forces, which would have Navy and air components to it. Okay, while the military guys were on their side of the room having their talks, the non-military members formed the second working group on political issues. And we met daily also, and we dealt with such fundamental issues as UNITA's agreement to recognize the existing Angolan government and its president. That was a big step for UNITA to say, okay, this is the way, and these guys are going to continue in power. That the government in turn had to recognize that Angola was going to become a multi-party state and UNITA was going to have freedom to conduct political activity and to run in the elections. This working group also dealt with organizing and the free and fair elections that would decide who ruled Angola going into the future and how these were going to be supervised. And so we created in the end a couple of institutions that would supervise the peace process. The senior one was the Joint Political Military Commission, which was again composed of the Angola parties plus US, USSR, and Portugal as observers, and with the UN attending the meetings. And this joint commission would oversee the implementation of the peace accords at a high level. That we then created a subordinate commission, which was called the Joint Verification and Monitoring Commission. And this commission, with the same membership, would have the responsibility for supervising the enforcement of the peace agreement. Now, the MPLA government, the government in Luanda, would continue to run the country. In the talks, the government representatives made clear their determination that they were going to extend the government's administration during the peace process into areas that were controlled by UNITA. Now, one morning, the UNITA reps came rushing up to me in a huge panic, and they said, "It's the police, it's the police." I said, "What about the police?" He said, "We forgot the police." I said, "What do you mean forgot the police?" He said, "The police are not covered in the agreement. The police, including the gendarmerie, which is heavily armed, will follow the extension of the government's administration into our areas. We will be confronted by the Angolan police. And one member of the delegation said, they'll kill us and we'll be helpless. And so then we had to stop and adjust and involve the police in the agreement. Okay, so as the talks went on, we're sequestered, we're there every day. There are all of these issues that have to be resolved. And so what the US delegation did, what I and my colleagues did, is we started writing position papers on this issue is teed up. What about the elections? Okay, who gets to vote? This is an issue. John Barley, our lawyer, would draft a position. And then we would go in and we would meet with both the delegations. We would first meet with the government delegation and we would say, here's what we think is fair, a fair position, the way we think this should come out. Now, for the government side, these are the pluses, but there are also some minuses, so you have to keep this in mind. Then we would go over and make the same pitch to UNITA. It said, this is what we think is fair, here's the position. This is good for you, this is not so good for you. In making these pitches, I would speak first, particularly to the UNITA delegation, which is made up of soldiers. These guys were fighters, all guerrilla fighters. And then I would look at Charlie, who was military intelligence, and Charlie would draw himself up and in a very somber tone say, from the point of view of military intelligence, and these guys would all sit up, of course, they were soldiers, here's military intelligence speaking. And then Charlie would say the same thing that I said, and then they would all nod. Okay, and then, but what happened was that we would then leave the papers. And about 2 or 3 days later, as the talks moved forward, one side or the other would bring up our position, present it as their own. The other side would agree to it, and we would keep going. Interestingly enough, while we were doing this, the Soviet delegation informally detached from the talks. They remained there, but their attention was totally focused on the breakdown of the Soviet economy, civil disorder at home, and the safety and well-being of their families in Moscow. So they spent almost all their time in the lounge watching CNN to try to learn what was going on in their home country and making calls back to the Soviet Union to be sure that their families had access to food. The leader of the Soviet delegation told me that it's very important that the foreign ministry in Moscow had a commissary in the basement, and he was certain that there would still be some food there so his family, wouldn't starve. At the time, the Soviet government had literally run out of foreign exchange. So the way the Soviet delegation operated is they would fly on Aeroflot to Spain, where they had an embassy. And Aeroflot had landing rights. They would then be picked up by the Soviet embassy in Madrid in a car. They would be driven to the Portuguese border. The Soviet embassy in Lisbon would send a car out to the border. They would pick these guys up and drive them into Lisbon. They'd put up in a hotel. The Portuguese government would then pay all their expenses.
Wow.
So
that's a real change. And real change in status.
Real change in status. One more point, which was really interesting about these, and then we'll talk a little bit about elections if you want to do that. One day, about halfway through the talks, the UNITA delegation came forward and asked to suspend the talks because while a member of their delegation went back to Angola for consultations. Now, privately, they came and told me that Jonas Savimbi, the leader of UNITA, did not control the UNITA generals that were fighting in the north. They were from a different tribe, and they had almost complete autonomy. And they wanted to keep fighting because they were winning, and they didn't want a peace agreement. And so they explained to me that there was only one person on their delegation who could go there, talk to the generals, and then if they disagreed with him, still come back alive. And that was General Gatto. That was his nom de guerre, El Gato. And General Gatto was about 5 feet tall. He was missing the part of his left arm just below the elbow. He had been in every war in Angola, starting with the colonialism. And he was the only guy that everybody trusted. And so we stopped. We waited a week. And then General Gatto returned. And he said he'd convinced the generals to accept the peace agreement with the following argument. He convinced them that they could get to Luanda faster via the peace agreement than they could by fighting their way in. And they bought it. And so the peace agreement went forward. Okay, Another and very important issue was elections. And after all, that's what we were really planning on getting to. So under the principles, if you remember back when I started this conversation, the ceasefire, the date of the ceasefire was linked to the date of the elections.
Yes.
And this was an issue which went on for a long time and almost disrupted the talks. UNITA wanted a very quick transition. The government wanted a long transition. UNITA wanted 12 to 15 months from the ceasefire to the elections. The MPLA wanted 36 months. The US eventually proposed 15 to 18 months. And the parties agreed, and the ceasefire date was set for May 15, 1991. But before we got there, we had long discussions with the UNITA delegation about the impact of holding elections in a rural environment during a rainy season. I learned a lot about weather patterns in Angola because they explained that in a rainy season, everything turns to mud, and their constituency was in the rural areas and not in the cities. So eventually, the date of the elections were set for September 1992 after the rainy season. Also, it was an article of faith for both UNITA and the US delegation that if there were just free and fair elections for both the presidency and the parliament, that UNITA would win, hands down, no doubt about that. And we actually spent several hours at one point in the talks discussing among ourselves whether the UN observer mission should leave Angola the day after the day after the elections, or whether they should wait a week just to see, and then they could go home. Because we were so sure that UNITA would win, democracy would somehow break out, peace would endure, and we would, this
solve that issue. Yes.
This belief proved to be particularly naive. And in fact, we should have known better, because a few months before that, when we had started talking about free and fair elections in a very serious way with the UNITA delegation, we quickly came to realize that they had no idea what an election was all about. And so we brought them to Washington and we put them through a course in elections, and they had learned about the difference between voting systems. What's a single constituency winner take all election? That's ours,
Yes.
One constituency, all right. What were proportional representation? What were runoffs? What were voter qualifications? What was registration all about? What were voting districts all about? Okay. So unfortunately, when we did get to elections, and of course, UNITA lost the elections, and UNITA then restarted the war, this proved sadly really disastrous for the UN, for the UNITA delegation. On the date of the elections, the UNITA delegation, that same team we'd been working with, was in Luanda, in the capital, in the UNITA headquarters office in the capital. When the civil war restarted in the interior, troops from the Angolan army attacked the headquarters, UNITA headquarters, and in the firefight, all the members of the UNITA delegation were killed. So peace can be a dangerous business.
Speaking of the UNITA delegation and the government delegation, what did you observe about intra-delegation cohesion? With many of the groups that we work with, non-state armed actors, civil society delegations, it's very difficult to maintain internal cohesion. Governments, it's a little bit easier. But what were your observations about the intra-delegation cohesion, and what steps were taken by the heads of those delegations to maintain cohesion?
I think the composition of these delegations was really fascinating, how we got to where we got. Okay, first of all, the Portuguese. So there were several false starts to the Angolan talks that went nowhere. And finally, the Portuguese assumed the role of mediator and stabilized the talks and gave it a framework and a focus. Now, the Portuguese were represented in these talks by their Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, like the number 2 or 3 person in their foreign ministry. Mm-hmm. The man's name was Jose Durão Barroso. Barroso went on to be the foreign minister, to be the prime minister of Portugal, and also the president of the European Economic Commission. Barroso was an amazing guy, even at that stage in his career. The guy who was the day-to-day chairman of the talks was a man named Antonio Monteiro. Monteiro was one of the maybe million or so people who lived in Portugal who had been born in Angola and had been forced to leave Angola after independence. And so Montero had a personal tie to Angola, and he used to tell us on and on about how beautiful the city of Luanda was during the colonial period and how it was gay and romantic, and there's music and dancing and everything. So that was the Portuguese. The Angolan government delegation was led by a professional diplomat from the foreign ministry and a member of the MPLA's Central Committee, because this was a Marxist-Leninist government. And it was composed of senior foreign ministry and military officers. These guys were university educated, and they were veterans of the 4 years of negotiations on Namibia. So they were professional diplomats and professional negotiators, and they knew how to organize themselves. The UNITA delegation, on the other hand, was a bunch of guys who had been in the bush fighting the war. Now, the leader, Jeremiah Chitunda, had a degree from Arizona State University. I never quite understood how that happened. But the rest of these guys were really guerrilla fighters. In the first round, which the parties did it on their own, the government negotiators walked out on the talks and came to whoever was there and said, "We can't talk to these guys. They don't know how to behave. They don't behave themselves. They all talk at once and they argue with each other. They don't present any ideas. You can't deal with them." And so we brought the UNITA delegation to Washington, and we put them through a training course in how to negotiate the way Europeans and American Western diplomats negotiate. And so they took that all to heart, and they were very fast learners, and they learned how to organize themselves. One of the more unique results of that training was that one of the members of the negotiation, his nom de guerre was the Butcher of Benguela.
Okay.
And during the training, one of the instructors had said that it's very important, if you do nothing else during negotiations, to always smile. And so this man always smiled, but it was the smile on the face of the tiger. It was the most terrifying smile you have ever seen. So in terms of cohesion, in each of these groups, cohesion was not a problem. They were, they all had vested interests, and they all were comrades in arms in one way or another. They'd all had a lot of experience working together, and so that really wasn't an issue.
That's actually fairly rare for a peace process. Usually, there's multi-level negotiations. It's the delegation negotiates among itself before it then goes into the room and negotiates with the opposing party. So this is a pretty rare instance.
The strain in our negotiations was not between the members of the delegation. It was between the Department of State and the Department of Defense, which, as you know, historically has always had differences of view. And so at a more senior level, OD would, interfere or inject itself when it's thought its interests were not being protected or it wasn't getting its say. The same way that the State Department would do the same thing if.
So the Angolans and UNITA had it together, but it was the Americans who had the challenge.
I think there probably, I'm sure there were disagreements, among these groups, but they didn't show during the talks, and that wasn't a dynamic. It was a dynamic for us, but after a career in the State Department or maybe in the Defense Department too, you learn that that's just a fact of life in Washington, and you have to work around it. Yeah. And oftentimes, the personal relationships bridge that in some way.
Yeah. And that's what's key, to have those personal relationships to bridge those different dimensions. Well, speaking of personal relationships, let's turn briefly to skills. What were some of the skills that you deployed as the head of the delegation, or that you saw that the Portuguese, the Angolans, UNITA deployed during these in order to get to durable yes? What skill set should be people focusing on, future negotiators be developing?
Well, I think skills, first of all, skills at clarity and clarity of communication. I think that perhaps the best thing we did during the talks was this unique situation where the Stockholm Syndrome, if you know what that is, had taken over. And sort of after we had been locked up for a while, there was a general understanding among all of us inside the building that if we didn't get an agreement, we were never going to be able to go home. They just wouldn't unlock the door. And so there was that. But in that context, the fact that we could draft clear, concise, and fair positions, and then present them to both sides in a way which we could explain, this is a point for you, and this is a problem for you, and then have those positions accepted just in, after a little conversation, maybe a tweak or two, but then have those become the sort of building blocks of the peace negotiations. I think communication, clarity, personal relationships, building bonds with people. And, the fact is, since we were engaged with these people, not only in the Angola talks, but also in the Namibia talks and other things, they saw us a lot. We saw them a lot. And so I think all of those things were very important. Good bureaucratic skills, basically this is a bureaucratic exercise. You have to be able to deal with your own bureaucracy and get your own bureaucracy to do what you want it to do. That's very important, and often just not appreciated. That one of the things that career officers in any government bring to this is their ability to operate the system behind them. And, a lot of times politically appointed negotiators, although they may have fame and fortune and a lot of background, they just don't understand how to get the bureaucracy to support them. And the bureaucracy ends up fumbling all over itself and screwing things up. And so bureaucratic skills are important. And then having support. And it has to be clear as you go into negotiations that the people you report to and your political systems are behind what you're doing. If that's not crystal clear, that the government is going to implement what you say it will, that's also a big problem. So probably those three things, those are the skills and those are the things that you want to be able to bring to negotiations.
Well, it's interesting, the front end, the front-facing diplomacy skills, but also the back-facing bureaucratic skills, and then the ability to bring your country, your government along with you so that you have that credibility. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the successes. Writ large, this was a successful agreement, issues with implementation and elections, but actually getting to an agreement, getting to a yes, was quite successful. Reflecting back, what were a couple of things that the parties, the mediators did that took advantage of opportunities that presented themselves to move forward with success?
I think one of the keys was the December round of negotiations, where the fact that we had the secretaries of state and the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, who by that time had actually themselves become friends. If you remember, Jim Baker took Shevardnadze out to Wyoming and they went camping together. But detente was becoming a real thing. And so and it was becoming clear to the Soviets that they needed to get out of these conflicts that they were involved in. They simply couldn't afford it. So we had this unique situation where at a very senior level, those levels had come together. And the fact that these two men agreed that they would meet with their opposite number on the other side in a very dramatic way in Washington on the same day, at the same time, and make it clear that we want this to end and we're not going to give you any more weapons. That message really sunk home. And then it was left to the parties to figure out, well, how are we going to do this on the best, in the best way we can so that we maintain ourselves. So I think that was very important. The fact that by that time we had, as a negotiating team, worked out a set of principles that we could present them the next day and say, okay, these are the 7 things that we think are most important. And the fact that we got those principles, once we had this agreement on the principles, for the rest of the talks, we could always go back and say, yes, but you agreed it would be a multi-party state, or yes, you agreed there'd be UN supervised elections, or yes, you agree that the ceasefire would be linked, the date of the ceasefire would be linked to the date of the election, so that we couldn't have a ceasefire and then the elections would never happen or something, and we had to have both of those things at the same time. All of those things were critical to getting to yes.
Okay. So getting an early statement of principles in writing, as
right.
well as the personal relationships among the key actors. Well, what were some of the challenges or near misses, things that threatened the success of the peace process?
I'm just thinking about really the best way to go about answering that question. Maybe okay, our mistake, our biggest mistake, the United States' biggest mistake, was our blind faith at the time that elections would produce immediate democracy and peace. Angola had gone from a colonial government to one based on Marxist-Leninism, and the country had no experience at all with democracy. It had no experience with free and fair elections. There was no tradition in Angola of the defeated party becoming the loyal opposition. There was no rule of law to provide the basic framework for democracy. So we lost track of the fact that democracy deals with how governments are chosen. The rule of law deals with how political power is exercised. So we made the same mistake of substituting in confusing this issue in all subsequent peace and stability operations we got involved in. And Patty Ashdown, who led the peace operation in Bosnia, wrote the following, which I think is really very interesting and prophetic. He said, in Bosnia, we thought that democracy was the highest priority, and we measured it by the number of elections we could organize. The focus on elections slowed our efforts to tackle the real problems, which were organized crime and corruption. In hindsight, we should have put the rule of law first, for everything depends on that. A functioning economy, a free and fair political system, civil society, and public confidence in police and courts. And so one of the things that we ignored to our detriment was the fact that organized crime and corruption played a major role in the conflict. UNITA operated from a secure geographic and tribal base in the southeastern part of the country. It was funded by diamond smuggling. The government operated from a secure tribal base on the Atlantic coast and was funded by the oil revenues generated by international oil companies, including many from the United States, in Cabinda province, which was nearby. The government was highly corrupt. So we had both sides, the leadership on both sides, had many reasons to just continue the status quo. Continuing the conflict served the interest of the political elites on both sides. So for this reason, when the war restarted, it went on. It stopped again for another peace agreement. It started again, and it went on, for another 10 years until Jonas Savimbi was killed, and then UNITA collapsed, and then that ended the conflict. So I think at a macro level, the problem was that we worked toward a conclusion, elections, which actually created a situation where there was a date certain that the decision, who ruled the country, the question of who ruled the country would be decided. And so the peace process was spent building up to that day, with both sides making sure that if the election went the wrong way, they would be prepared militarily and politically to restart the war and see if they could get a better deal next time.
So we thought the elections were going to lead to democratic transformation and rule of law, but it was really just an opportunity for one side to finally settle the question of political power.
It took a long time for people in the United States like myself who worked on these issues to recognize that probably the best thing that you could do during the peace implementation process was to work toward creating good government, functioning government on whatever basis, and then holding elections far off in the future, and then starting elections at the local level, not at the national level. So you would have local elections, which would create democratic experience, which would identify new leaders who then could work up, and eventually take over. But we didn't have that knowledge at that point, and so we made mistakes, and we made them again and again.
Well, Bob, that in a sense answers the last question that I have for you, but I'm going to ask this question anyways because you've got so much great advice and so much great insight. I'm sure you'll come up with an additional key takeaway. But my last question is, what is the one key takeaway that you want those who are listening to this program to remember 5, 6, 7 years from now when they're involved in negotiations and they think back, yeah, right, Bob Perito had mentioned this and it's stuck in my head all of this time, and I'm going to act on it to build a durable peace?
I think commitment of the parties. we had these naive beliefs that all we had to do were create institutions or hold have a particular activity like an election or create an institution like the Joint Commission, and that would solve the issue. We didn't pay a whole lot of attention to the attitude of the parties here, and sometimes the attitude of the parties, is masked. I remember one time being present when Jonas Savimbi made a speech in public in the United States, and he stood up and said, "I will proudly serve as the leader of the loyal opposition in the Angola parliament." Well, of course, that was not true. He was not prepared to serve. And so I think that, it's very important to keep in mind that the solution to the conflict really relies with the parties themselves, and to look for ways in which you can identify those people on each side that are really interested in preserving the peace, and those are not. And that's why I think, to go back to something I said a few minutes ago, and that is that, when we get into the peace implementation process, the post-conflict, after the ceasefire process, that we look for ways to focus on good governance, on creating institutions of government that actually work and provide public services, and that's where we focus, not on who's in power, but on getting things set up and running and stabilizing society. And then once you've got that in place, people are then more willing to make open choices about political leadership. If you remember in Bosnia, which is something that we were involved in together, in Bosnia, we raced to elections. The people who were elected were all of the old organized crime figures and the generals who had run the war. They then became members of parliament, and so they were immune from any kind of prosecution. They then kept doing what they were doing because it was in their interest, and so the parliament didn't function, et cetera. And Bosnia today remains a state that's pretty much controlled by the same people that caused and prosecuted the war, and the country goes nowhere. So I think the point of negotiators should be to create a situation where the peace ends up in a pledge to improve the economic and social situation in the country, to create political reconciliation, and then eventually we get to elections. And the other point is here, which is important, is that to do this, you have to make sure that the terms of the settlement and all of these things that you want to happen are actually put down in writing in the peace agreement, so that when somebody says, "Wait a minute, I don't want to do it that way," somebody could say, "Well, look, Article 4, Section 12, it says that we will have this institution. It will be composed of the following, and it will do the following." And we agreed to that. And now, we're holding you to that. If you remember, the Bosnian accords were accords. There was the Bosnian agreement was basically a ceasefire agreement. The accords were little understandings about how things would happen. Mostly they were commitments to have follow-on negotiations. Those follow-on negotiations never occurred. The only one that did happen was one on organizing the police. But, that only went so far. So, it's very important that you have a longer term perspective on what you're doing, rather than let's just get to an agreement 2 years later, the magic 2 years, we will hold elections and then we'll all go home and the country will be left,
No, it's words matter, rule of law matters, the political
Absolutely.
infrastructure is important. And you and I both, Bob, have been in so many agreements where, oh, well, we got a handshake, we got a wink and a nod, we have an understanding on these vague words. It's like, whoa, no, this is the social compact for the future governance of the country to pull it out of conflict. So the precision in the words really does make a difference. Bob, I really wanted to thank you for your time and your insights. It's been a real honor and privilege to be able to spend this time with you, getting the firsthand account of the Angola peace process, the insider's view on how this came about. And, I'm deeply grateful for your very candid assessment of the role of the Americans, the Soviets, the UN, as well as the role of the parties. So thank you again, Bob, and I really appreciate your time and your energy with us.
Thanks a lot, Paul. It's been a pleasure talking with you. All the best.
Thank you.